Greg Barnsdale, author of Do Not Ignore Your Mortality. And I've invited Greg back to the show as the topic is so important on so many levels. And if you haven't seen the first episode, I would highly suggest that you go and view it before watching this one because you might get a little more context. However, with that said, we're going to get right into it. Greg, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate your interest.
Well, it's an interesting topic. It's an important topic, and unfortunately, I don't think we get enough attention to it sometimes.
Yes, I agree, and that's why I wrote this book on the whole topic of facing our mortality, so that basically we're ready for it. Because from what I've experienced in both the funeral and the financial planning industry, we're much better off to um, have our affairs properly in order. The fallout is much better than not preparing and just ignoring these things.
Well, to be prepared, but also, it's just such an uncomfortable topic that pretty much everybody puts it off, right? Before we started, I kind of related my own story. I'll give it for the benefit of the audience. So when my own mother passed away, of complications to a broken hip, 2 years after the fact. That's what they called it. Um, I had lots of questions in my head as well about, final arrangements. They throw these things in there with, they call them DNR forms, do not resuscitate, final wishes, and that sort of thing. And it was difficult because my mother was grappling with her own mortality, and maybe didn't really want to make some of those decisions. And of course, my brother and I really weren't in a position to make those decisions either, right? Because we were um, kind of having to do it spur of the moment. So I can definitely relate to it being important to make those plans.
Yes, and as I was saying to you, Chris, when my mother died about 5 years ago, she suffered a broken hip as well, and died as complications due to that too. People who are older who tend to fall, but quite often break their hip, and it can often end up in their demise.
Yes, you were also mentioning uh, the difference between the different programs as well. I believe you mentioned MAID and the Die with Dignity program as well.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Since I've published this book 2 years ago now, I have been reaching out to quite a number of people, especially on LinkedIn, to various types of backgrounds from the medical, legal, the financial, the faith community as well, and the funeral industry. And the follower count now that I have on LinkedIn is well over 7,000. But I find there's many people who are finding this type of message very meaningful and wanting to share it, which I'm grateful for. But one of the organizations that I strategically reached out to was Dying with Dignity Canada. And they were intrigued with my background in the funeral and the financial industry, and they asked me to be a part-time technical writer for them, which I am now. So I helped provide some information on some guides that they were looking to put together for their audience across Canada. And recently, I submitted an article to them in regards to a family member of mine that died just a couple of weeks ago, and it was quite different actually compared to the situation a few months ago of a cousin of mine that opted to die through the MATE program.
And could you outline what the MAID program is? What they do?
Yes, ever since 2016 here in Canada, medical assistance in dying became legal. And Canada is one of a growing number of jurisdictions where this um, euthanasia or medical assisted suicide is now legal. And a growing number of people feel, as I do, that people should have that choice at the end of their life, that if they choose to die because they don't want to live with a terrible disease, or they feel that their situation is just not the way that they want to continue living to be able to make that decision. There seems to be more and more choice in our world today for people to make that decision.
That raises a couple of questions. Actually, a lot of questions. But the main one is when when you're making your will, um, or your living will, when you maybe have an accident and you're incapacitated in some way, do those programs account for that as well? Saying that you would uh, rather die with dignity than be on life support your entire life, or how does that work?
Well, in my cousin's situation, he was in his 60s. He had had a series of strokes and lost the use of his one arm and one leg, and was bound to a hospital bed, or a bed, and bound to a wheelchair. And he did not want to be moved to live out the remainder of his life in a long-term care facility. And he stressed this to me a number of times. And I told him honestly that if I were in his shoes, I may decide the same thing too. I could appreciate where he was coming from. So he applied to the MAID program and was approved a short time later to end his life through that MAID program. But there's an aspect of this whole MAID issue, and it's called advance requests. And right now, the Canadian rules do not allow for people to have it recorded as an advance request down the road that they wish to end their life through the MAID program. And that's why there's a lot of talk about this in the media, especially through these types of organizations that are looking to change the rules around that.
And what does the process for that look like? I mean, is there like a long waiting list, or is there?
Well, my understanding is that more and more people are opting to end their life through the MAID program. And the support that these types of organizations that are promoting this are receiving across countries like Canada is strong support. Many people feel that they too want the choice to end their life on their own terms, especially in the sense that if they're living with a disease, or in a situation that is just they don't want to stay in that state any longer.
And well, I mean, the waters get really muddy too, right? Because I mean, you've got the person, and then you've got the doctors, and then you've got the family, right? The family obviously wants to keep their family member around for as long as possible, right? So, um, from your perspective, how should that conversation go? Because I mean, I imagine I mean, you've been through it a couple of times, I'm sure. So, how does that conversation usually go?
Well, everybody's situation is so different, Chris, and that's where this whole issue of being proactive and thinking through what we want to have happen, if this should happen or that should happen. But the crux of it really comes down to speaking with our family members about what ultimately we want to have happen. If we're incapacitated and can't make decisions for ourselves, or upon our death, because our family needs to know that.
And why do you think that we tend to put this off? Like I can come up with a million reasons in my own head why I've done it, but why do you think in general people tend to put this off?
Well, as I stress in this book that I wrote a couple of years ago that's behind me here, we tend to assume that tomorrow is going to continue just as all the yesterdays have. I've talked to a lot of people who have told me, when I worked as a funeral director, or when I worked as a financial planner, helping people plan for a good retirement and reduce the risks of something throwing them off track, like a serious disease or injury, or a premature death. And I've had people tell me many times, well, I've made it this far, I'm going to be fine. And there's a lot of people that have that type of assumption that things will just continue on in that sense. But when you've seen the sorts of things that I have, working in the funeral industry for as long as I have, uh, you know that there's a lot of people that you see in that type of role who probably felt the same way, and it didn't play out in their favor.
No, that's for sure. We're definitely not expecting it. But you know what's interesting, and I love going back to this. We like to think that tomorrow is going to be there and it's going to be, business as usual, right? And I love that business as usual because there was a 1970s MIT study uh, called the limits of growth, and it was, plotting what would happen in population decline and all that fun stuff. But what's interesting is their business as usual scenario was the end result was we were all going to, we were all going to die. And it's funny how we can have that dichotomy, right? I mean, we obviously know every single day it's inevitably going to happen. We just choose to, ignore it or stick it on the back burner, almost as like a defiance in a way.
And it's you're exactly right, Chris. Yes, it's the sort of thing that we don't want to think about. And I found that as a financial planner, when I was helping people with their retirement planning, they were quite often really keen to talk about their investments and such and how they were doing. But when it came to the aspect of reducing the risks along the way, such as the aspect of a heart attack or a stroke or a premature death, I had some clients who just simply didn't want to go there. But as a certified financial planner, it was it was mandated as part of my role to talk about all of these things holistically, and it was one of the main reasons why I wrote this book. I've tried many things that I just felt that a book would be the best way to get the message out there for a lot of people, and not to procrastinate, which ties in directly with your podcast.
No, for sure. And one of the issues that I've seen as well. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, and there's something different here, is that we don't tend to put a monetary value on it. I know that some life insurance agents and some other financial planners actually include it as like almost an investment portfolio, because what they say is that the cost of a cremation or burial today is probably going to be 5 or 10 fold by the time that, if they live long and fulfilling lives, could be 5 or 10 times more than it is today. So if they look at it that way and they prepay their arrangements today, a $5,000 prepayment today could wind up saving them $35,000 down the road. So it's, but because you don't see that value, you don't see it on like a little ticker, then it's almost as if you need to make portfolios for them and show them the rising costs year after year, and when you show them that, it's like, oh, what's this chart? Oh, this is how much you've saved by, taking care of all this today.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And we're all different, whether we are more focused on the numbers or whether we are more focused on emotional types of issues. One of the things that I have figured out over the last 2 years since publishing this book of mine, Chris, is that I've really boiled down my message about preparedness to these points, and I think it's really inspiring, and I've had a lot of people agree with this. But I stress the fact that end of life planning helps reduce the stress of aging. And that's a big issue on its own. But it also leaves our survivors more financially and emotionally resilient. And that's a big issue. It leaves them in a place where they are more likely to get along instead of bickering, and they will be less inclined to contest the final wishes of the person who has died. It the process often leads to more meaningful legacies. It also tends to help out charities because of the benefits of charitable giving, and it takes immense pressure off the courts from otherwise having to deal with so many unorganized estates. And all these things cumulatively help bolster the economy. It's a massive win, really, for everyone.
It's just hard to put that in a pretty package, right? Sometimes, and those different aspects. If somebody wants to kind of gently broach the subject with with their family or their loved ones. I mean, I've had this happen to me. I'm sure you've had it happen to you. You start talking about those things, and they just kind of stonewall you, and then you kind of wait a little bit, and then you say, hey, maybe we should really talk about this, and then you get stonewalled, and
Yeah.
then you try again, and then you do it when they're on their deathbed, and it's like, well,
I mentioned that in my book. It's a bit of a funny part where I've added some humor about this, but when somebody is hospitalized and we're hoping that they get out, and we bring, flowers and cards and wish them all the best, and tell them to get lots of rest so that they can get back and get their lives back to normal, that's the worst time to bring up these types of things, because it's almost considered taboo. Can you imagine asking somebody on their deathbed if they would prefer a wood or a metal casket? We just don't do that, and rightly so. But that's really comes back to this whole issue of talking about these things when minds are clear and times are normal. It's the lesser of two evils.
What are some things that you think we could do to maybe make the topic more, I guess, palatable?
Well, when I published this book, Chris, I intentionally included a few questions in it that readers and listeners could use to get these conversations going with their family members, and hopefully not get stonewalled, as you said, because I've seen it too. I've suggested to clients to go home and talk to their parents and or their kids about it, and they basically got shut down and were quite frustrated over it. But I've since come up with a fairly extensive list of questions that anybody can print off from my website free of charge. And they're called, I'm calling them the probing legacy questions. And there are 15 for very basic introductory type conversations. And then there's another 15 for more advanced conversations, but they're proving to be quite effective.
And what would your favorite, or well, maybe favorite's the wrong word. What would be the one that you would pick out of that list personally?
Well, this is something I heard an older financial advisor say at a seminar years ago, Chris. And his question to his financial planning clients, he was a life insurance specialist for the most part, but he said something along the lines, or would say to his clients something along the lines of, if you died last night, Mr. Client, what position would your family be in today? Or if you died last night, who would be in charge of wrapping up your life? And a lot of people just, they don't know. They've been putting these things off. They know it's good to plan, but they procrastinate.
Well, I mean, again, nobody really likes thinking about those things, but and sometimes what might happen too is, and this used to happen a lot. Um, I held my life insurance license for a little while, and what would happen, in more than you'd think, sometimes people would say, they would get funny, like, oh, what do you want to do when you get buried? And some guy said, one gentleman said, well, I want you to fill my casket with popcorn, so when you cremate me, you can have some popcorn, and you can. Another guy said, well, you stick a spring under me, and play Pop Goes the Weasel, or things like that. I don't think that humor is necessarily a bad thing, but you know, you eventually have to swing back around and get to the crux of the matter. No.
Yeah, we do. We do. We it and these topics are in front of us all the time. But as I stress within this book that I published, a lot of, even though we see it in the media, we see it in Iran and Iraq and all the fighting going on over there in Gaza and so on, and the pandemic that all of us went through, that I think threw the world for a loop when it happened. We're seeing these sorts of things in the delicate nature of life all the time, but a lot of us are simply tuned right out. And when I say us, I'm not tuned out, because this is where my head's been at for years. But a lot of people are tuned out, and they put it off, whether it's superstition or whatever it is. They just don't get around to it. And actually, by the way, that's why I came up with Round to It. Conversation coasters, I call them, with my logo on the other side. So I'm doing everything I can, Chris, to help people get these conversations going in a positive manner.
Something just occurred to me, and I want to know your thoughts on this. Do you think that maybe another one of the reasons that we don't sit down and actually make these plans is because we don't have an acceptance of the fact that things will inevitably end? I mean, there's a brand new Netflix series that came, not series, documentary that came out what was it called? Don't Die, I think, it was about what's his name, Brian Johnson. I hope that's the right name, Brian Johnson. Where he's doing all this stuff. He spends $2 million a year extending his life, supposedly. He does gene therapies, he does facial things, he does exercise. Do you think that these kinds of movements are more detrimental to society than maybe planning?
Well, I have heard of these types of very wealthy people, Chris, that are doing all they can to extend their lives. But I've also read in that same type of article that there isn't a push from the medical or the um, political side to really extend life, because it seems from this last article that I had read in that regard, it seems to be indicating that it's kind of a hopeless cause, that we are all going to die and there's really nothing that any of us can do about it. But to answer your question in regards to that type of movement, where there is more of a movement is within this death positive movement that started decades ago. And we're seeing it in the media too. I'm sure you've seen the series 6 Feet Under that came out years ago that was very popular. It was one of my favorite series, not surprisingly, I guess. But even this one that you had mentioned, in all, people typically are very intrigued with things like death and sex and those sorts of things, because especially with death, we don't know what's on the other side, so people are very curious about it. But more and more people now are being more upfront and having these conversations. I was surprised in the hospital 2 weeks ago how openly the medical staff were talking about my father-in-law's death just before he died.
Hmm. You mean like talking about it like in an informative manner, or like in a
And even talking to him.
hmm, okay.
I've seen a few people die, not a lot of people. I've seen more people after they have died, but it just seems to me, from what I'm seeing in my circles and the people that I'm speaking to and such, Chris, that there's more of an open transparency in regards to death, even to the point of openly telling people who are failing on their deathbed that yes, you are passing. And can you imagine receiving that type of news, and what you would think at that point in your life? You would need a lot of emotional support from family and friends at that very delicate time.
And yet that's that's when most of us, for superstition or emotional reasons, or whatever reason, we just don't want to. Well, I mean, I can't think of any other like legitimate reasoning. Is that we just don't want to be there when it happens.
Yes, and that's what Woody Allen, the comedian, or he was a comedian and an actor, I guess. But his famous quote that I had jotted down years ago was, he said, "I'm not afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens." I can relate to that. I don't want to die either, but I'd far rather be proactive and have my will, my power of attorney, and all of my passwords. So my wife knows where everything is, and I'm always keeping those things in mind, knowing that at some point I could get hit by a bus or have another brain tumor or and not be here. So they need to be prepared.
Yeah, just going into that, I mean, that there's really no, there's no really one standard of a way to store this information or share this information. But they always used to say, once you've made it, you have a copy of it in your house. You stick it in a Ziploc bag in the freezer or something, so that it can last a fire or fireproof safe, or a bank. But I've noticed that, and this is I've seen this happen, where you have one copy of a will with one lawyer, you forget about it, and then you make another copy, and then you make another copy, and then you change it, and then you don't remember which lawyer you used.
Yeah.
So, what would be some tips that you would have in keeping all that information together in one spot?
Well, and this is a totally biased opinion here, Chris. But the best advice that I could give your listeners is to either buy or listen to my book. The audiobook is 99 cents. It's not very expensive. but within this book, I lay out all this type of information about it. Like really, the crux of what you're asking is, instead of leaving kind of a haphazard mess of different affairs set up here and there, we're much better off to have someone that we know and trust, who's going to wrap up our life as our executor, and have ongoing conversations with that executor, so that they know exactly where we're at. And every Thanksgiving or every Christmas, talking to our kids and our closest family members about where we're at with our planning. Because if we don't take those times to do it when the family's together, quite often it just never gets done. And I've seen it far too often.
That just gave me an interesting idea for a Christmas present, but I don't know how well it would be received.
Well, I have a friend of mine who wrote a book on this same sort of thing. He's from Montreal, and I was listening to a podcast that he was on, and he had said, I'm not really into gifts, but I would rather, when my family's all together at Christmas or whenever it was, he says, that's when I like to talk about these things, and I want my family to my kids and such to listen to me about where our planning is at. And I think that's I truly do think that being organized in this way, Chris, is one of the ultimate gifts of love that we can provide.
Oh no, for sure. And again, it all goes down back to I believe it goes back to like the acceptance of the fact, right? We all like to. It's not that we don't know our mortality, because I mean, we all know we can't go out and jump in front of a bus. We all know that we're going to get older, but maybe it's that, that level of acceptance, right? And again, that because you have the anti-aging movement, you've got, pills, exercise routines, whatever it may be, right? We just want to stay for as long as we can, and
Yeah.
that goes down to, I guess, to the would you say the fear of what's on the other side?
Yeah, a fear and a reluctance, and just this whole aspect of procrastination. And I know I keep bringing up that word, Chris, because it just beautifully ties in with your podcast here. I can't help it. I'm sorry. But you're right. The beauty industry is a massive multi-billion-dollar organization industry that touts the fact that getting old and frail is not the way to go. And I get it. I don't want to get old and frail either. None of us do. But as I keep stressing to people, there are so many benefits to having our affairs in order, from greater survivor resilience to reducing the stress of aging, leaving our loved ones in a position of strength. Well, who doesn't want to do that?
Well, I mean, that's a good argument, but I think, what was it? I'm not going to call it the survival instinct, because that's irrelevant, but kind of the if you think you've got well, we talked about that a little bit before, superstition, right? Like if
Yeah.
sailors don't swim, pilots don't fly. I'm not sure how that relates, but you know, but people say that, I don't want to get life insurance because as soon as I do, it's gonna be, that'll be the day that it happens, right? Because I'm inviting it in, right? Do you? I'm just curious. Do you have any statistics, on the number of people that have said no to life insurance and have ultimately wound up needing it, to those who have said yes and never needed it?
I don't, but I can tell you, Chris, that I've had many, when I was selling life insurance as a financial advisor, and health insurance and RRSPs and TFSAs and such. In regards to insurance, I remember distinctly that the faces of the people years ago, a few of them, who would say something to me like, Greg, I don't want this insurance. I'm not going to be here anyway. Yet they had a wife and young kids that needed the protection in place. And we had gone through a questionnaire, and they gave me the figures that they felt were made sense for their situation. But that's it, to be honest with you, and maybe you felt this way too when you were helping people with life insurance. It can be a very frustrating role, because here you are trying to help people, and yet at the same time, even after them telling you yes, they need it, the numbers prove it based on their numbers that they've given you and their situation, they will sometimes say, well, I want to think about it, and then it just never gets done. It's very frustrating.
And what would you say is the number one reason that maybe people don't get life insurance when they say they want to think about it? I mean, is it a cost factor sometimes? Is it a
Yeah, well, I think cost certainly plays into it, and also the fact that regardless of what you hear on television about these types of insurance plans that will cover you basically regardless of your age or stage in life, or regardless of your health, and no health questions asked, the very best type of insurance, whether it's life insurance or health insurance that anybody can buy, is the type of coverage that is medically underwritten, where you answer the insurance company's 30 or 40 or 50 different questions, where they can check you out head to toe at the beginning upon application, as opposed to the type that they peddle on television, where they say, you'll be approved, no problem, even if they almost give you the impression you can almost be dying, and you'll qualify for the insurance, and no insurance salesman will call. Well, that's the type of insurance typically that the underwriting is done at the time of a claim. And when family members have the emotional baggage of a serious disability or an incapacity or a death on their plate at the same time, and then they've got to deal with an insurance company who's asking for all this type of medical information, that's not the way to do it. You're better off to bite the bullet and get the best type of coverage up front.
hmm. And just so our listeners are aware, what does that process look like? Because I can hear people complaining in the audience already, like, oh, but then I gotta go and I gotta sit and I gotta take a day to get medical test, or a week to get medical tests, or I gotta get blood drawn, and oh, I don't like getting blood drawn.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. But the insurance industry, Chris, makes it very, very simple. The insurance application, say for a life insurance policy, because this kind of relates to the theme, right? So if somebody wants to apply for a life insurance policy, whether it's a term life policy that goes up in premium every 10 or 20 years, or it's a permanent policy that has a level premium for the rest of your life and doesn't increase in cost, the application process is much the same. It's a list of maybe 30 or 40 or 50 different questions that have to be answered in detail, and the insurance agent basically submits that to the insurance company that is being applied to, and then they check with your doctor and they check your medical records, typically based on the amount of coverage you're applying for and your age and what their rules are at that particular time. And yes, you're absolutely right. You may have to provide a blood sample. You may have to, if somebody's applying for a big amount of insurance, they may have to go to a doctor and get on a treadmill. I've seen that happen occasionally as well. But that type of process, yes, it does take a bit of time, but you're far better off to prove to the insurance company that you're in decent shape. You don't have to be in athletic health by any means, but that's the best time to prove that you qualify for it.
So just and again, every insurance company is different. Every situation is different. But do you have maybe even like a rough example of what the cost difference could be between going and getting the underwriting at death when something happens versus getting underwriting done up front?
Well, I can't really give you a figure, Chris. It would be too difficult, because it's really based on the age of someone when they're applying for the insurance, how much insurance they're applying for, what type of insurance they're applying for, whether it's the type that increases in cost or has a guaranteed level premium. So there's just too many factors to be able to give you a range that way. I'm sorry.
No, it's no, I wasn't looking like that. But I do know that as an example, when I was doing like personal shopping, I know that there was one company that paid out immediately. There was no dealing with the corner or anything like that. But the premium was $100 plus, right? Whereas if you went to the other place where they did have underwriting, it was like $10 or $15 or something. It was the difference was quite substantial.
Yes, yes. And that's why, generally speaking, I think people are better off to speak to an insurance broker or a financial advisor who represents brokers to a number of different companies, where he or she can actually figure out what your needs are based on what you want to have happen if this or that should take place in the future, and then shop the market for you to find the best value.
You know, Greg, this has been a really great conversation. We are coming up pretty close to the time. Um, is there anything that I didn't ask that you wish I would have asked, or anything that we didn't hit on that you think we should have hit on today?
Well, as you said, there's so much to this topic, but one of the other things that I had also created recently, along with that probing legacy question list of questions to help people get these conversations going, was a short little quiz, and it's a 5 question, very quick quiz that anyone can take. It's on my website as well. Do not ignore your mortality.com. But this quiz, if anybody answers those questions and gives them a bit of thought, they're going to realize within a very short time, perhaps a minute or two, that their affairs are not likely set up as thoroughly as they should be. And the reason that I came up with this quiz, again, is I'm trying to inspire people to lean into this and get planning and not put it off, because there's just too much negativity that it results if the planning is not done properly. But I just wanted to stress to people that this type of quiz is effective at inspiring people to, as my book does, take action and not put it off.
No, and no, 5 questions is definitely not too much to sit there and take a quiz. So, I would definitely recommend that you who are listening, you go ahead, you go over to the website. We are going to put that in the description so that you won't have to grab pen and paper and try to remember it. And just take those questions and maybe just have that discussion with your family members as well. Right, Greg?
Yes. Yep. That's the biggest takeaway from this whole type of message, Chris, is for people to give more thought and keep in mind that they could be disabled or dead at any point. And just, one of the things I'm often doing, it's and I think more and more people are doing this, is that I have a binder here in my home office where I keep all of our passwords and such, because we're always doing things online. So every time I change it, I change it in pencil so that my wife knows exactly where she can access all these various accounts that I have.
Well, it's definitely a good idea. Um, have you ever used a password manager besides like a binder, or do you?
No, I'm considering it, but I haven't done that yet.
Would you see any downsides to using something like a password manager as opposed to like a hard copy somewhere?
I don't know enough about how password managers work, to be honest, Chris, and that's something that I need to research a little more. Maybe you could enlighten me at some point if you know more about it than I do.
Oh, I just know that when I hear having a binder of passwords, like all of a sudden, my heart just goes racing and stuff because I must have over 400, 500 different passwords right now. And if I didn't have a password manager, I'd be lost. And you're talking about a binder. I don't know how big your binder is, Greg, but my binder would probably be like that thick. But then, of course, the actual important ones out of that are probably only about 20. But I'm sure you can understand the uh, the panic I would have if somebody needed to know every single one.
Yes. Yeah. So I should be considering a password manager, my friend.
Mm. Well, Greg, again, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for agreeing to come back and talk to us more about this. I know that it's not the world's happiest subject, but in the end, actually, it is because while there aren't truly any happy endings, there can be more gratitude, and you can focus more on the good times you had without muddying it up with the bad time of figuring out how to deal with those situations after the fact rather than before.
Yes. Yeah. And your listeners should keep in mind that having their final affairs in order is actually one of the greatest acts of love.
Thanks for that reminder, Greg. Again, thank you so much for being on the show. To all our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. And just remember, I mean, if you can't find that motivation or inspiration for yourself today, maybe just go out and try to be that motivation and inspiration for someone else. And we'll see you again next time. All right.
All right.